So let's go back to our new project on Replit. I'm going to get rid of some of the stuff in um, the page here that we don't really need. So we have this like default HTML document. We can change the title. We'll just call this intro to tone.js. Let me actually make the font even bigger. Okay, I think that's good. And let's close the files. Okay, and this is like a little tag for the Replit, uh, for a link to Replit. We don't really need this here, so let's just get rid of that. And then for this, it has this script already here, so we can just go ahead and use that. I would usually, I might name this something other than just script.js, but since it's already there, we can just use that. And let's get rid of this as well. And I'm going to get rid of this hello world. And so we'll just put a script here. So we need to, for Tone.js to work, it's a bit like 3JS and all these other libraries where we need to have a reference to the code base for us to be able to use it in our own project. So I'm going to just go to the Tone website. So it's just tonejs.github.io. And there's a bunch of different examples and stuff in here. I'm going to copy this and paste it into the Discord. Um, and so one thing that's confusing here is that it says, to install, say, npm install tone, and then it says import. All this stuff probably doesn't really make sense to you guys because it's basically for like developing with using like a Node.js setup, which is something that you probably haven't gone over. So there's an easier way to get Tone into a project, which isn't really documented here. So there's another resource for Tone that's really useful, which is just their own GitHub page. So if I Google Tone GitHub and go to this first link here, there's actually a sort of a similar section here for installation, but it goes over a second way to add Tone to your project, which is using this unpackage.com. And this is basically just like adding an external script. So this is an easy way to get Tone into the project. We can look at the example here and see what it looks like. So they just have a script that adds Tone and then a new script that sets up the project. So that's a little bit easier. Last time when we were working with 3JS, we like went to the 3JS page and like downloaded the file and brought it over and did all this stuff. And I actually like doing that stuff, but it takes extra time that isn't really necessary since we're on the website already. One thing that happens with these libraries is they change from time to time. So if you write a bunch of code and then you come back and this website is missing or there's a different version that doesn't work with your code anymore, that can create problems in the long run. But I'm not super worried about that, so I think we'll just go ahead and grab this script. So we'll just copy this and paste that directly into our project, right above our own script. And the way that to know if this is working, if we run this copy of the project and I open up the console down here, we should be able to see Tone. So if I type in Tone and type execute, oh, it says Tone is not defined. Okay, let's look at the real project console over here and see. Oh, this is okay. So it didn't load it because it's not HTTPS. So let's run that instead. Okay, so let's see if that works. Okay, there we go. So now that worked. So it's interesting that we didn't get an error in the console for that. Let's see if I go to errors. Okay, whatever. But it'll actually show you that it's working here when it is running. So when I run this page, you can see it actually says Tone.js version 14.7.77 here. That actually shows us that the library is running because it's always going to print that out in the console when it's running. So if you see that in the console, that means that it works. And if I type in Tone into the console and click execute, you'll see that it returns this object that has all of the various stuff that we use in Tone here. And you can see there's a whole ton of stuff. So it's going to take us a second to go over it, but obviously we're not going to cover every single little thing, but we'll cover kind of the basics. So that's how we get Tone into our project. That's pretty simple. But while we're on the HTML page, there's another thing that I want to add, which is we need actually something on the page for the user to interact with in order for Tone to start working. And this has to do with the audio API. We can actually see an explanation of this on the GitHub for Tone. If we scroll down a little bit, you're going to see audio context. And this actually might be in the wiki. Where do they talk about this? Oh, starting audio. Okay. So what it says here in starting audio, um, this is not really that new anymore, but at some point the browsers changed. And this was done so that, random advertisements couldn't just like pop up, or spam couldn't pop up when you open a website and start using your computer audio. So now if you're on a website, you actually have to get access to the audio first through some user interaction. And so there's a thing in your browser called the audio context. Every browser has it. If we type in audio here, we'll see this is the audio context. It's just a JavaScript thing, and it's what is used by our browsers to play any audio, whether it's a video or music. If you're on Spotify, on YouTube, anything like that has to plug into the audio context in order to play audio. And so there's no way to do it without some type of user interaction happening first. And so we do need to add in an event so that the user can click in order for us to get Tone started. So we need to add something in our script. It could really be anything. I'm just going to add a button, and then we're going to get a reference to that in JavaScript to start our project. So I'm just going to make a HTML button here and give it an ID so we can reference it. I'll call this start, and we'll just say this is our start uh, button. And we might add other events in here to control Tone at some point, but for now, this will be good enough to get us started. So when I click run, you'll see there's a little start button here, and we can click on that to start things. I also will probably eventually add in, if I'm working on a project, like some key command so that I don't always have to like go over here and physically click start, because that's kind of a pain sometimes. So you might add like a key command in so that you can hit a key on your keyboard and that will start the sound as well. However you do it, we do need to have some user interaction before Tone will get started. So that's everything I think we need to add in our HTML project for now. So let's go back to our files and go to script.js. And there's nothing in here, so we're going to start from scratch. And we're just going to do to start what they're doing here, which is to get Tone started. And so there's a couple of things happening in here that may be a little confusing. So we'll talk about what's happening. So to start with, we need to get a reference to the button for people to click on it. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to use a constant. So I'm going to create a new variable and call this start button. And I'm going to set this equal to document.get element by ID and get a reference to the start button. And so this is some like really, really basic JavaScript. We're just making a variable, calling it start button, and then we're assigning it to the document that's our website, and we're using get element by ID, which is going to look through our HTML for some piece of HTML that has the ID start. And so of course we just made that. It's this button right here. And so once it finds that, it's going to return a reference to this button to our script. And then we can listen for a click. So if I log this button, let's say console.log start button, and I'm hitting on the Mac, I'm on a Mac today, I'm hitting Command Enter to click the run button instead of having to use my mouse to go up here. On Windows, you can hit Control Enter, it should do the same thing. So there's my start button right there. And so we can see we've got a reference to it. That's the HTML. And if we look in here, you can see all the stuff that's related to it in JavaScript. So now what we want to do is we want to say start button dot add event listener. And this is just going to listen for any type of user event that's happens relating to the button. So we're going to look for a click event. And when we get that click event, the one thing that's a little tricky here that you probably haven't seen before is we need to use a special function called an async function. So we can see async here. And this is also a callback function. We did actually talk about callback functions in when we were talking about Three.js a little bit. But we never talked about arrow functions. We actually don't have to use an arrow function here. The arrow function is really just a different way of writing function that some people prefer. It has some differences in terms of uh, the um, the context, the code scope, but it's not really relevant to right now. Anyway, the thing that we really need is this term async. And the reason we need that is because of this term here, await. And the reason we need all of that is because when we start tone, we don't really know how long that's going to take. And so we can't run our code right away. We have to wait for that code to be done. And once it's done, then we can run the rest of our code. So that's why we have to use this async, which is saying it's asynchronous. So sort of like an asynchronous class that you might take at BMCC, it's instead of meeting at the same time like we're doing now, it takes place at different times depending on when the students are doing it. So this is a similar thing where we don't really know how long this will take. So it's going to happen outside of the rest of our code. And once it does happen, then we can move on from there. So in here we're going to write async to say this is an asynchronous function. And then we're going to write a callback function right in here. And so a callback function is just a function that's stuck inside of an argument to another function. And they're used all the time in JavaScript. So we just write function. There's no argument, so we just have empty parentheses. And then the function that we want to run, we just put inside these curly brackets. And then I use semicolons. Not everybody does. You can see this example doesn't have any semicolons, but I usually prefer semicolons. Anyway, so now we have to await tone. So we're going to say await tone.start. So this is going to get the audio engine running for us. It's going to wake up the audio context in the browser. And then once we're done with that, we're going to run the rest of our code. So now I'm just going to make a call to, let's call it, what do we want to call it? Let's just call it our start function. Uh, well, it's actually kind of the same function here. Let's use setup. We'll use a P5 function type. So we'll say setup. So then we're going to have to define this function setup. And for now, let's just say, let's log tone dot, I'm trying to remember what the term for this is. Let's see. For the audio context. Oh, I think it's just context. Let's say tone dot context. Okay, so let's run that. And so now I have to click the button and there we go. So we get this context and I think we can check to see if it started. Let's see. Okay, the name is context. This is very small. Let's go over here and reload this. So we're going to click start and then we'll look in here. So that's our tone context. This is actually just like a reference to the audio context with some stuff added in. And we can see the state is running. So that's actually what we want to do. So let's log tone.context.state, and then we can run this. Okay, so now we can see it's running. So that's what we want. And we could check this, but I'm not really worried that this isn't going to be the case. So we don't really need to check this. I'm just going to comment this out, and then we'll start actually using tone. So yeah, that's our basic setup. As I mentioned, I'm going to put a little comment here. User has to interact to start audio in browser. So this whole thing is basically just because we can't start the audio automatically. We need some type of user interaction to start the audio. Okay, so now we're actually ready to use tone. And so there's a couple of different places you're going to want to look when it comes to learning about tone. So on the Tone website itself, there's the API. This is a really good resource. It has everything that you can do with Tone. It has like a nice big menu that you can search. So if you're like, I want to make a sampler, I can type in sampler and then click on sampler and it'll give you a code example. Usually it'll do some type of thing, like you'll be able to hear it. So we can run that and we can hear that sample. And then it has all the different properties and methods that are associated with this sampler object, and then lots of different examples and explanations of this code. So there's a lot of stuff in here that won't make sense quite yet, but it's a good reference once you get started and kind of get used to how the language works. So that's one resource that's really useful. The other, so it has examples. And so this is good for just playing around with what different things sound like. So you might be looking at like, different effects and be like, oh, what does a ping pong delay sound like? And it'll bring up this example and I can kind of click on it and see what it sounds like. So that sounds pretty cool. And then it'll have a reference to the API. So here's the API. This is the code that made that example work. I can hear that here.
Professor, we can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't hear anything?